Putin is really putting himself in a very strategically precarious position because China wants to eat Russia's lunch in Central Asia, where you have the former Soviet states, where the Chinese have been trying to use political and economic diplomacy to weasel its way and build dominant influence, the Belt and Road Initiative. Russia, of course, hates that because Russia sees those former Soviet and Russian imperial subjects as being the rightful Russian territory. But I think Russia has made a decision that they're going to be okay with maybe ceding some leverage to the Chinese on the global grand scale to support the immediate Russian operational needs for its war in Ukraine. I think Russian power globally in the long term will likely deteriorate because of that decision.
Hi, I'm Jo Crawford, and I'm here in Washington, D.C. for the 75th NATO Summit. And today I'm joined by George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Jo. It's a pleasure.
I want to begin with the recent Russian attacks in Ukraine, which is supposed to have killed at least 38 people. What's your assessment of this attack?
Yeah, well, it seems very clear that the Russians conducted a missile strike against a civilian hospital. The jury is out on whether or not that was a deliberate strike against a civilian target or if they were gunning for a nearby legitimate military target, but it doesn't matter. The Russian military is still completely responsible for the results of the strike. It is an illegal strike. It does not fall within the norms or laws of armed conflict. And I'd also add that the Russians have put forward a series of very pointed disinformation operations that seek to either obfuscate their role in the strike or deflect the blame and claim that this was actually a Ukrainian missile strike. That, of course, is entirely baseless, and all the available evidence indicates that it was a Russian cruise missile.
We can't ignore the timing of this attack. Do you think that this has any relation to the NATO summit?
I think it's likely symbolic. That very high-profile strike against the hospital was just one of the cruise missiles, part of two large strike packages that the Russians launched against Ukraine yesterday. I think the Russians are trying to demoralize the Ukrainian people. They're trying to send a message because they understand that these strikes they don't achieve militarily significant effects at the front, but they do strike at the hearts and minds of the population, so to speak. And Putin has a long history of using these sorts of strikes on symbolic days during symbolic times in order to demoralize the Ukrainian people.
Do you think we can expect any more attacks from Russia over the coming days then?
I think it's extremely likely. I mean, the Russians conduct such airstrikes and missile campaign strikes quite literally every single day. Yesterday's was particularly bad because of the really heavy munition that managed to slip through the Ukrainian air defense. But these strikes have been going on for a very long time, and they will very likely continue. They also highlight the need that the international coalition supporting Ukraine augment Ukraine's air defenses. If Ukraine had more Patriot launchers, more interceptors, then the likelihood of this missile slipping through and hitting that central target would have been much lower.
UN officials say that May was the deadliest month for civilian casualties in almost a year, as Russia has renewed its air campaign. Do you think that this recent attack could bolster Ukraine's demands for more air defenses at this NATO summit?
I think so. It underscores the need. The Ukrainian air defense posture, it's lacking, it's weak, and the Russians are exploiting it. And these intensified Russian strikes really highlight exactly what is the current lack, that gap that needs to be filled. And it highlights the need that, if we want to send Ukraine more tanks, more artillery pieces, more ammunition, that includes the subordinate requirement to also cover the skies so that those Ukrainian objects are not destroyed either in the assembly areas near the front, in transit, or in the deep rear. I also think that these intensified Russian strikes, including deep into Ukraine's rear, in western Ukraine, gunning for those supplies as they're coming across the Polish and Romanian borders, it highlights the absurdity of the current US policy vis-a-vis Russia, right? Because we currently forbid the Ukrainians from using American-made weapons to target Russia's rear. Meanwhile, the Russians get to conduct unrestricted strikes against Ukraine's rear. That's not fair.
So NATO members, they're likely to declare that Ukraine's path to membership in the alliance is irreversible. What does this mean for Ukraine, but also for Russia and the war in Ukraine?
Sure. Well, I believe it's Article 10 of the NATO alliance states that NATO has an open door policy. Any country that meets the requirements, the membership requirements, is allowed to join NATO. The Ukrainians have made it clear that it is their political intent to join the alliance, and all that they have to do, therefore, is meet the requirements and have the political consensus. And I think that largely speaking, there is a large political consensus that Ukraine will eventually one day join NATO. I think that is the signal that they're trying to send, and they're decisively rejecting Vladimir Putin's demands. I'd note that just back last month in June, Vladimir Putin articulated his demands for Ukraine for any sort of ceasefire, any sort of negotiations, and as a prerequisite. And those demands were the Ukrainians must permanently get rid of and abandon 4 territories, all of which the Russians do not control in their totality. And also Ukraine must abandon its aspiration to join NATO. And I think this is a strong NATO rebuttal saying, it's okay, we're not going to accept Vladimir Putin's premise. We are not going to give the Russians a veto over NATO, and we're not going to change the NATO charter because of Russian demands.
How do you expect Putin to respond to that, though?
I believe Putin will continue to be cynical, as he always has been, because Putin really has few limited options for what he can do to respond. His military is decisively engaged in the war in Ukraine. They've made very small gains over the last several months. The campaign seemed to be slowing down, and we're looking towards a window of time when the Ukrainians are actually slowly stabilizing and building up for what will likely be a new effort on the Ukrainian behalf to contest the initiative and conduct some sort of counteroffensive. Putin really can't do much. The most effective thing that Putin can do, and what I think he will intensify, will be his strategic messaging. Because Putin knows he can't materially affect the battlefield in a substantial way. He will continue to conduct these extensive strikes with the entirety of Ukraine. The most decisive thing Putin can achieve is convince the key policymakers in Washington and London and Brussels and Berlin that the Ukrainians really shouldn't be in NATO, or the Russians really probably the map in Ukraine can really only get better for the Russians, or Vladimir Putin's demands are somehow reasonable. If Putin succeeds in planting that brainworm into a sufficient number of senior officials and key decision makers, then yes, then Putin can actually materially affect the situation. And I think his messaging offensives, these strikes, the way that the Russians conduct warfare, they're all designed to reinforce this narrative, not to change the facts on the ground, but to change our perception and alter our decisions.
What's the likelihood of that, though? We've heard in the past Putin making lots of claims about nuclear threats, things like that, which have been passed off as being baseless, empty threats. Do you think that potentially he's lost his capacity in conveying strong messages?
I don't think so. I think it's an extremely effective Russian tool. I think Putin will lean into it harder. And it's very, very effective. I mean, it's taken us 2.5 years of belabored pitch battle policy debates on pretty much every single thing that we've decided to send Ukraine, and every single policy that we had vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia. We belabored, do we do not send the Ukrainians Abrams tanks? Do we do not send them Bradleys, 777s, HIMARS, ATACMS, F-16s? The most recent debate has been, do we allow the Ukrainians to defend themselves and strike territories in Russia? We had a small policy change about that back in May last year, or May of this year. And now we're debating the contours of exactly how deep should we allow the Ukrainians to strike. The Russians have attached their red lines and their blackmail to each and every single one of these policy debates that we really agonized over. And now strikes with Western-provided weapons in Russia are a regular occurrence, and there has been no escalation. So I suspect that the NATO alliance will continue to slowly make the right decision, but it's unfortunate because when we make these decisions in this slow, staggered way, it is completely antithetical to achieving momentum, and momentum is a really overlooked and important dynamic in this war. By doing it in this slow way, we've allowed the Russians to have time to mitigate, find countermeasures for sort of slow piecemeal implements, and it makes it much easier for them to be able to incrementally decrease the efficacy of our policies.
And following from that, we had the US aid package to Ukraine get approved. We're seeing that slowly trickling over to Ukraine, but some have regarded it as coming too slow. We're calling this, a war of attrition. What would you say is the current progress being made by Russia in their offensive? And do you think that Ukraine has the capability to defend itself?
Let's talk about the Russian offensive. So the Russian command realized in October 2023 that the Ukrainians were on the ropes. They were in a very bad position, both in terms of material and manpower, and that the debate in the Congress in the US was going to be a protracted, ugly, partisan undertaking. And so the Russians began to anticipate that after the winter, after the spring thaw, there will be a window of opportunity where the Ukrainians will be in an even worse position. The American aid will not be there. The Ukrainians will be in an even worse place, and there will be a window of opportunity for us to conduct an operation. So the Russians prepared for that. The aid got passed in April 2024. Then it started slowly coming over to stabilize. Then the Russians began their summer offensive in early May. This was a little bit before when we actually anticipated the Russians to commit to their offensive. The Russians didn't actually end up assembling the full operational force that they wanted. The group of forces that they prepared in southwestern Russia, just north of Kharkiv, for example, that was supposed to be between 60 and 100,000 troops. In reality, they got between like 30 to 60,000 troops, so about half as much as they wanted. And we were expecting the operation to kick off in late May, early June. It kicked off on May 10. So the Russians, seeing this window of opportunity shrink, they decided to go into it. And since then, the gains have been quite small. The Kharkiv operation has not gone according to Russian plans. The Russian gains in eastern Ukraine have been also, very belabored and very small. The Russians, nonetheless, have managed to achieve some tactically significant gains. They can lean into compounding the small gains, and they have come closer to key logistics lines that supply the key fortress cities that constitute the backbone of Ukraine's defense of eastern Ukraine. The situation looks like it's improving right now for the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainian situation will get better. However, I'm still very concerned because the way that we're going about helping the Ukrainians is not the kind of approach that signifies that we are confidently enabling and giving the Ukrainians all the capabilities they need to defeat this invasion. The Ukrainians right now are in the process of forming somewhere between 10 to 14 brigades. And the equipment that the United States and the entirety of our coalition that we're sending Ukraine, we don't have enough tanks and vehicles and artillery for 10 brigades. We have enough for, give or take, above 4, and maybe a little bit more than that, but certainly not 10. And so the Ukrainians, in space and time, with them fixing their manpower and doing more mobilization, they're now at the unfortunate place where in a couple months, they're going to have more brigades than equipment. And I'm not exactly sure, well, those men in those brigades, they're going to be told to hold a line, sit in a trench, that sort of thing, but they're not going to be properly equipped to be able to have the survivability we need them to. And they're not going to be equipped to engage in mechanized offensive operations, the likes of which can actually change the tide of the war. So we're stabilizing the situation slowly, but we're not actually doing the things that we need to push the Ukrainians into victory.
And talking about Russian troops' losses, at what point do you think that Putin is going to be faced with serious shortages of manpower?
The decisive factor doesn't seem to be manpower. The key thing is materiel. The Russians are burning through their Soviet inheritance of all of the Soviet-era tanks and armored personnel carriers, and they've been pulling the majority of their destroyed equipment replacements from long-term storage. From what open source researchers can see from satellite imagery, looking at sort of these long-term open-air storage sites and vehicle graveyards, the Russians have pulled a very large number of those vehicles. It's difficult to ascertain which ones of those have been cannibalized for spare parts and stuff, and then which ones actually can still be serviceable. But the current estimates indicate that the Russians should be running critically low on, they will have critically exhausted their armor that is visible, that we can see with imagery in the next 2 to 3 years. So 2025, 2026 is going to look to be a very difficult time in terms of vehicle production. Because we know that the Russian tank factory, Uralvalgonzavod, that most of the work that happens there is actually refurbishing of these previously manufactured vehicles. They do new serial production, but it's like 90% of the tanks that roll out are refurbished, not actual new production. So things are going to look hairy for the Russian military in about 2 or 3 years, which means that we have to really lean into ensuring that we keep the Ukrainians in the fight at least until then. And that, of course, has the critical assumption that the Chinese don't become more decisively involved in supporting the war. And it also assumes that the Russians don't miraculously improve their ability to manufacture new vehicles. The Russians have managed to create a whole lot of new drones and things like that through technology exchanges with Iran. And so, it's not completely impossible that they can drastically improve their production.
Yeah, because that's what I wanted to ask in terms of Russian allies, North Korea, Iran, China. How do you see their dependency on weaponry growing over time? Do you think that those allies are going to be receptive of it?
Yeah, it's the jury's still out on that. There is clearly a coalition of these hostile states that is growing. The Russians and the Chinese have become much closer than they were in the past 5 years, and the Chinese have key interests in ensuring that Russia's invasion of Ukraine ends up not being a decisive Russian failure. If Putin can achieve the preferable outcome where somehow we achieve an armistice or a ceasefire where the Russian Federation claims it's annexed more territory and we are back in the might makes right world, and that is very good for Xi, because he will take that precedent and apply it to his revisionist agenda for Southeast Asia and Taiwan. The Iranians stand to benefit as well. The Iranians are getting cash hand over foot for their technology exchange and their production of drones. And the Iranians are also going to likely become the beneficiaries of other Russian technologies, satellite technology, space technology, ballistic missile technology. The North Koreans, I believe they're going to be the beneficiaries of satellite and space technology, as well as possibly submarine technology as well. These are niche capabilities that not very many states have developed, as well as the Russians have. And if these different actors get their hands on the niche capabilities, then it drastically increases the costs for our allied states to be able to keep these bad actors in check.
What's your thoughts on the visits by the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, to Kyiv, Russia and China?
It seemed that President Orban was trying to leverage Hungary's participation within the EU presidency and doing these one-on-one visits to Kyiv and Russia to present Hungary and himself as a mediator or a negotiator on the behalf of the EU. To show that, we can have negotiations, we can have a dialogue, we can have a back-end channel, that sort of thing, which of course the EU Commission just completely denied and said that it is not within Mr. Orban's right to represent the EU. That's not what Hungary is doing now. He's only there in a bilateral Hungary to Ukraine and Hungary to Russia, Hungary to China perspective. I think Orban is, of course, one of Putin's agents within the European Union. Orban has undertaken a series of Trojan horse spoiling activities that advance Russia's agenda for weakening Europe, weakening NATO, and ultimately setting the proper conditions for Russia to be able to pursue the Kremlin's own revanchist agenda for Europe. And I think Orban was there to try to amplify this larger Russian-driven meta-narrative that, listen, this whole ugly business in Ukraine, it can all be over. There is a peace, peace in our times is on the horizon. All we have to do is come to the talking table with the reasonable Russians, and we can work a deal, and this will all go away. And I think having Orban go out there and make it seem like some Europeans are interested in that makes that information operation that much more amplified.
He also made the claim that China is neutral on this conflict. What do you make of that?
I don't think China is neutral. The Chinese have supported the Russians with informational support, political support, tacitly. They've given the Russians maneuvering space to be able to minimize and shirk responsibility for Russian war crimes in Ukraine. The Chinese proposed peace plan is also incredibly advantageous to, revisionist states that want to destroy the rules-based international order. And not to mention, there's a variety of Chinese businesses that engage in sanctions evasion and help the Russians source components and material and dual-use technologies that are important for the Russian war machine. So yes, the Chinese are technically on paper, I suppose, independent in that they have not signed on to be a co-belligerent with Russia, but in practice, the Chinese objective is that the Russians are successful.
Another figure in the mix is the Turkish President Erdogan, who said that he could help to end this war. However, we did hear that Putin's spokesperson said that he can't play as an intermediary. Do you think that we can see any future involvement from him?
It's possible. Let me answer the question with a different answer. The first thing is it's entirely premature to have any sort of discussions about negotiations. The key actors that have to negotiate are Ukraine and Russia. And these two belligerents are on completely opposite sides of the coin right now. I mean, they're so far apart in terms of what they are doing on the battlefield, in terms of what their stakes are, in terms of what the negotiating positions are. Like, it is completely incompatible for negotiations. So I find the large amount of discourse now about, oh, who could help facilitate negotiations? Well, there won't be. Can we have it sometime soon or sometime later? I think this is so incredibly premature. And I think that's part of the reason why the Russians drive this narrative, because they want to seduce us with peace in our times. It's just around the corner. So I find the premise of the discussion to be preferable to a Russian information operation, number one. Number two, to answer the actual question about Erdogan, the Russians have cooperated. They've cooperated Erdogan. They have a very unique relationship with Turkey. There was the whole Ankara process for the Syrian civil war that the Russians managed to get themselves into. There was Astana process, and of course the Turks, they bought S-400 air defense systems from the Russians, much to NATO's IRK. So there are some strange interlapping ties there that the Russians have historically leveraged to try to drive wedges within the alliance. I think Turkey's position has solidified a little bit since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But it's very possible that they might try to broker that deal. And I think Turkey is probably going to be a less polarizing figure to facilitate any such diplomatic moves than, say, Hungary and Orban.
Looking at the China-Russia relations more generally, they classed it as a limitless friendship, but we have seen cracks in the framework there. What would you say is your current assessment of the situation now?
Yeah, well, it's very clear that Putin and Xi have, I think, aligned objectives when it comes to Ukraine. Not to the extent that Xi wants to actively support it, but Putin is really putting himself in a very strategically precarious position, because China wants to eat Russia's lunch in Central Asia, where you have the former Soviet states, where the Chinese have been trying to use political and economic diplomacy to weasel its way and build dominant influence, the Belt and Road Initiative. Russia, of course, hates that, because Russia sees those former Soviet and Russian imperial subjects as being the rightful Russian territory. But I think Russia has made a decision that they're going to be okay with maybe ceding some leverage to the Chinese on the global grand scale to support the immediate Russian operational needs for its war in Ukraine. I think Russian power globally in the long term will likely deteriorate because of that decision, and I think Xi does stand to eat some of Putin's lunch in Central Asia in the long term. So let's make no mistake here. These two autocrats, they have aligned objectives in some ways, unaligned objectives in others, and I think there are opportunities here for us to try to exploit. But of course, that assumes that we ourselves have our own strategy for how we're going to go about defeating these autocracies. I'd also note that it's very interesting. It means that we have to start thinking about the world and the theater in different ways. here in Washington, we have Europe and we have Asia, and those are two separate things. And the commands and the resources and the strategic thinking for these two things are like, housed in two entirely different organs. But with the coalescence of the Russians and the North Koreans and the Chinese and the Iranians, sort of the Eurasian landmass is coalescing into a tighter, more closely knit theater. And so now it's not really the debate is about, oh, China's the pacing threat and Russia is a secondary, tertiary tier threat. It's now, there's this coalition of threats that transcend the geographical borders that we have imposed about how we look at and analyze these things. We need to reevaluate that and stop thinking it's Russia or China. It's starting to look more, it's both and.
Do you think it's naive of NATO to not have as much focus and involvement in the Pacific theatre?
I don't think it's necessarily naive. I think there are constraints. Individual NATO states are deeply involved in the Pacific theater, and it's been really interesting to see how the South Koreans have been a very consequential actor for supporting Ukraine with their massive ammunition deliveries that ended up coming from South Korea to Ukraine. It's really interesting to see how Asia has become so connected with this war in a really unexpected, this is my opinion, unexpected way. But I don't think it's necessarily naive. NATO is very engaged. They do the best that they can. Of course, there are prioritizations. It's a geographically bounded alliance. It is primarily focused on Europe. I think NATO will continue to evolve and grow to the coming threats, and that's the great thing about NATO. It's a coalition of democratic states. We grow, we evolve, we learn over time, and it's the most successful alliance that history's ever known.
My last question is, what would be your assessment of Putin's state of mind right now? What do you think his next moves will be?
Putin has a theory of victory. He articulated it in June of this year at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. And Putin made clear that he thinks he can still win this war in Ukraine. And he's banking on one critical assumption, and that is the West will either abandon Ukraine or the West will not decisively commit to supporting Ukraine, and there'll just be this protracted, long, muddled through war in which the larger Russian Federation will come out victorious at the end. Putin said that basically, it's okay that the Russian military is not conducting sophisticated or effective large-scale combat operations that, have operational maneuver, that go into the depths, that exploit penetrations and do encirclements and that sort of thing. He basically said it's okay. We're going to keep making small gains, and that's how it's going to work. And I think Putin has basically accepted that this is the way that he's going to win this. He's going to win this through manipulation. He's going to win this by seduction about ceasefires and red lines and appeasement can work and that sort of thing. And I think between his nuclear rhetoric, between trying to fragment the alliance with these various different political black sheep that are being introduced at this very decisive time, Putin is not wrong in thinking he does have an opportunity to win the war in Ukraine through fragmenting the alliance. And so it's a time of choosing for us to think very difficult and think very clearly about these difficult decisions that we have. And are we going to continue to support it? Are we going to lean into supporting? Or are we going to grant Putin for free the victory that he thinks he can achieve? I think that's where I think his thinking is at.
What do you think he's going to do next?
What he's going to do next, I think we're going to likely see an expanded Russian campaign of sabotage within Europe itself. There's already been several events and it has been increasing, but he's going to lean into it. Because as the alliance continues to lean into supporting Ukraine, Putin's going to start gunning for the factories, the defense industrial bases, the ammunition warehouses and the depots and all of that stuff. That activity is going to intensify. And so we will see a continuation of the conflict escalate in different ways.
Thank you for joining me on Times Radio.
Thank you so much for having me.